What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you some highlights for patch 1.1 for Warhammer 40k Rogue Trader. This particular patch is quite massive, covers basically every area of the game, and while I will obviously be going over the important stuff, if I were to cover everything this patch touches, we would be here for hours. So with that in mind, if you're having some specific issue you want to see if this patch happened to have fixed, the patch notes will be linked down in the description below. With that in mind, to give a brief overview here, we are talking about expanded voice acting, quest and narrative fixes, buffs to Space Marines, nerfs to officers, a nonsense amount of fixes to mechanics and items, AI and combat improvements, quality of life improvements, just to name a few. But first, this particular patch does come with a variety of fixes aimed at addressing crashes and bugs people might have ran into, alongside optimizing certain areas of the game, which theoretically should make things run a bit smoother for everyone, though obviously your mileage will vary on that. In terms of some narrative changes though, we have things like the epilogue screens now properly resolving. I actually noted in my own review of the game that some of the epilogue slides would give you slides for both outcomes of something that might have happened instead of the one you chose. It also looks like portraits for companions after certain story events will now change appropriately, alongside a host of continuity issues being addressed, such as companions speaking about things that haven't happened yet, alongside simply adding extra things to already existing quests, such as your companion Jay's quest to get some paperwork notarized, so to speak, having been expanded to be even more ridiculous. Though I will say most of this appears to focus on Irelet, Cassia, and Heinrichs. Moving on a little bit though, we then have all of the mechanics changes. So by far the biggest part of this massive patch, we saw tons of sweeping changes to the way calculations were made, damage was rolled, etc. One of the biggest changes at large here is that a lot of items that provided flat bonuses have now been changed to percentages. This is mostly aimed at reducing the sort of outrageous top-end numbers you could find yourself dealing, and while it is technically a bit of a nerf for certain builds, enemies across the game have had their stats rebalanced as well, and for the most part these were actually lowered. And the patch notes specifically state this is to address the fact that theoretically a lot of builds might actually deal a little less damage following itemization changes that they've made. So you don't have to worry about enemies remaining as difficult to kill. They've been also balanced to reflect these changes. And in terms of those changes, some of the big ones are Space Marines at large have been adjusted, increasing their stats. Your Space Marine companion starts with special equipment to get them out of just the basic gear you pick them up in. They also have a much higher base health alongside being able to act as cover for your regular companions. But at the same time, in terms of nerfs, probably the most notable one is the changes they made to the officer class. For those who are unaware, this class allows you to provide extra turn to your allies, and properly utilized, it was absolutely busted. It seems like it's still going to be really strong here, but there are a couple more restrictions to curve out the outrageous stuff. For instance, their move, Bring It Down, that gives a teammate an extra turn is now limited to once per turn, at least for that same ally. They've also reined in the amount of momentum those characters earn, meaning that you'll be able to perform their ultimate abilities less often. Outside of that though, we see tons of sweeping changes to all sorts of things, mostly having to do with the types of changes I've already mentioned, that is to say rebalancing and changing calculations here, but also fixing and addressing how these things showed up in tooltips alongside, say, busted damage number, predictions, that type of stuff. Though they did also mention that the final boss of the game actually received updates to its mechanics to make it, frankly, more difficult. You could actually kill the last boss in just a couple turns, even on the highest difficulty, utilizing certain methods. I assume that's what they are talking about there. Speaking of items though, our Eldari companions such as Irelet or Marazai can now equip a lot of items that they weren't able to previously, which means it seems they loosened up the specific requirements for their human or Xenos status in terms of equipping certain items. We also have more specific gameplay improvements. For starters, things like improved NPC AI, which is to mostly get them to stop murdering each other via things like burst weapons and AoEs, and to also stop unnecessarily running into your attacks of opportunity when they just did not need to. There are also more quality of life options here, such as the ability to sort talents and abilities alphabetically, and also allowing you to add talents and things like that to your favorites menu. But then for perhaps the, I would say, most requested update or change, if you will, is that they brought full voice acting to things like the prologue and companion chatter throughout the game, which should pretty substantially increase the amount of the game that is voice acted. And while it's still not fully voice acted completely, it's a pretty big step in that direction, and considering how people are always asking Owlcat Games here for voice acted games, it's certainly a nice thing to see. And while I would say that just about covers the highlights, I do think it's worth mentioning that this patch does actually touch a lot more things as well, such as adjusting certain things about exploring individual areas, fixing some issues with colony management and the space battles at the same time, and even addressing a few co-op issues, allowing you to hire mercenaries in co-op as well, just to list a few extra. So when I say this patch is massive, I truly mean it. Again, if you have a specific issue, you probably want to check the patch notes themselves for it, which are linked in the description below. Though that will pretty much do it for this video, but definitely do let me know how you feel about this patch and fixes or changes you'd like to see moving forward, which of course simply means to like, comment, subscribe, all the YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.